It's worked so far, but we're not out yet.
I wanna know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I wanna know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy.
Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Aaron Coker, a.k.a. Caliban, and if God wanted us to have 3 nostrils, he'd have given us 3 index fingers. I'm joined on this episode by Alex Knapp. Alex is a writer and associate editor for science and games at Forbes.com, covering topics like science, technology, and culture. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Permission to come aboard granted. Today we'll be talking about The Most Toys, the 22nd episode of the 3rd season of Star Trek The Next Generation. Batman, Spider-Man, Doctor Who, Scrooge McDuck, any hero is nothing without a horde of villains to contend with, and the heroes of Star Trek are no exception. The best villains in fiction are dark reflections of the characters that we love, and their very existence is often a confutation of the principles that a hero stands for. They are the nihilistic yet plausible answer to the question that the hero's existence asks. And even though the near-perfect future Trek represents is free from many of our modern wants, it may never be free from those who want that much more. And really, why would we want it to be? But we'll talk about that a little later in the show. First, Alex, whenever I have a new guest on the show, I always ask about their backstory. How did you first become a Star Trek fan?
I honestly can't remember not being a Star Trek fan.
Answer.
I watched it in syndication growing up. I still have very strong memories of watching the premiere of Next Generation when I was 8 years old, and watched it the whole way through. Watched DS9 the whole way through. Watched Voyager. Caught up on Enterprise on Netflix. Seeing all the movies in the theaters that I was able to. I have just always loved Star Trek.
Well, I think it's great that your enthusiasm carried you through to see all of the series. I know for myself, I have a similar kind of backstory. And for me, just the pressures of life and just getting older caused me to kind of drop away, so that I haven't really seen the entirety of Voyager. And so far, I've seen more for this show, but my Enterprise watching is not great. There's a lot of, I've seen all the kind of big hits, but otherwise I haven't seen the whole series.
It was hard to watch when it was on, just because it was on at, a weird time. And, I remember, when it came out, and I feel like, even more so than other Trek series, it took a little bit longer to find itself, I think.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of just getting going when it got canceled.
They were also taking on a difficult proposition, which was to do something radically different. Like, what do we even do at this point? Prequel series set far, far, into the past of the Federation. And so, I don't know. Like I said, I like a lot of what I've seen, but there were some ones that weren't so great too.
Well, yes, that's true. But
the foot-finding episodes.
Yes, Next Generation certainly has those episodes.
Oh,
too.
Absolutely, yeah. We've talked about a few on this show for sure. You originally got your start in the law as a lawyer, isn't that right? Why did you decide to transition to writing?
Well, I was always kind of writing, in the background, and the thing about the law is I kind of came into it by default, like a lot of lawyers do. I came out of college not really knowing what I wanted to do, but, I liked arguing about politics, and I did well on the LSAT, so I went to law school.
Sure.
It just, the work didn't speak to me, and so when I had an opportunity to transition careers, I just jumped at it. So.
Yeah. That's interesting. I have a couple friends who studied law, and one in particular who got his degree in constitutional law, and this was, in the early mid-90s, and he did it kind of in the same way, enjoyed law, enjoyed politics, and people asked, why are you getting it in constitutional law? Like, what are you going to do with that? he's like, I don't really know. And he didn't really do much with it then, but now with, disputed elections and sort of all the things that are going on, I feel like he probably could do okay if he had stuck with it up to this point in our political reality. But yeah, well, that's interesting. As a science writer and editor for Forbes, you got to have your finger on the pulse of many different fields. So do you mind if I ask you about some current topics in science and technology?
Sure.
First off, every billionaire worth his salt seems to have a rocket company these days. Do you think that corporate interest in space travel is the right way forward, or should we be embarrassed to meet the Vulcans in a Starbucks branded rocket?
That's a great question. I think that the answer is kind of both. What the billionaires are doing in space is really in a lot of ways just geared towards their own businesses. So,
right.
There's definitely a love and enthusiasm for it, but the way most people make money in space is communications and internet satellites, and staying connected. That's still the primary driver of revenue. Private industry has always had a role in even the government-run space programs. Boeing and Lockheed Martin and those big defense contractors like that were back there building rockets in the 50s and 60s, and now there's just some startups who want to do the same thing,
right.
like SpaceX. I think that government is probably always going to be at the forefront of exploration and things like that. I doubt there'll be a Starbucks branded rocket meeting aliens, unless it's by accident, just because there's no money in exploration. I think that the government is if it were up to me, the government would be doing the exploration and then building the infrastructure that would kind of allow businesses and colleges and research groups and things like that to more cheaply do business in space. And in the past few years, NASA's actually been working towards that. And I think a lot of people don't know this, but there are laws and programs in place for private businesses and even colleges and schools to get NASA's help on building space projects and things like that. And on the International Space Station there are lab experiments that the astronauts run. It's a big part of their day, and a lot of those lab experiments are not just for businesses but for even elementary schools
Sure.
when they're able to fundraise for it and things like that. So I think at best it's a partnership.
Okay.
And I think it can be a fruitful one if it's done right.
Hopefully that's true, and the future can sort of cut the difference between the totally desirable but utopic Star Trek future and something
Sure.
that's totally cynical and business driven like The Expanse. We can maybe
Right,
get
yes.
right down the middle of that.
Well, even in the original series, a lot of Kirk's time was spent cleaning up after like mining companies and things like
Right,
that
yeah.
got into trouble.
Yeah.
So
A lot of colonies that were there to support, like mining operations, a lot of robot freighters and things like
Right.
that. Yeah. Everybody's concerned about data safety these days. It seems like there's a story every day about some company losing millions of logins or social security numbers. Is this just an inherent problem of our digital world, or should companies face severe penalties when they fail to protect consumer data?
It's interesting because a big part of the problem is because the internet was never intended to convey private information, and so it was intended just to communicate and between scientists and researchers and other things. So all of the protocols, all of the infrastructure, everything by default is open. And it has just, I think, been a challenge to get these things locked down, to get them secure. It's more expensive in large part because it was never designed to be locked down.
Yeah.
And I definitely think that there should be more protection and more ways to provide for security. But I think that regulations and things like that need to operate from that understanding. And as new infrastructure gets built out and there's new technologies going up in terms of satellites and going up in terms of new kinds of laser communications and quantum encrypted communications and some cool things like that. I would hope that security is starting to be baked into the infrastructure. You see that a little bit. A lot of websites default to HTTPS now and other things. So I think it's getting there. But a lot of it just stems from how the internet developed.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is a public awareness as well.
Sure.
I mean, I don't worry too much about my data, but like the whole DNA testing kit fad is really worrying to me. Like, nobody has time to read the 10-page long terms of service or whatever, and so they don't realize in some cases their data is being used for things that they don't know about. There's good effects. There was a story recently about how a testing kit company's data helped catch like the Golden State Killer. Right. So that's good. But, if people probably didn't know that their data was being shared with the FBI and law enforcement agencies, which is somewhat troubling.
Yeah, one of the most amazing things about that to me is, at least Facebook is free. You're paying the DNA customers to take your data.
Yeah, take it and this money. Yeah.
Right. So, there's an interesting company that's been started up by George Church, who is a really brilliant geneticist at Harvard. And he started a company for genomics information, but they pay you for your your DNA.
All right.
They have a lot of security kind of baked into how they're doing it to keep people's information private, but still have it be of use for research and developing treatments for disease and things like that. So I think that's a cool way to do it.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of the teens that got like $200 so Facebook could like take all of their data or whatever that most recent story was.
Of course, then you look at Star Trek and you look at the maybe this is just Starfleet. Maybe it's not like this elsewhere in the Federation, but you watch an episode of Next Generation, and it's like you need to know where someone is. You ask the computer.
Yes.
And Riker's always on holodeck 3.
Yeah. Well. Of course.
and the episode that comes before this, before the most toys, Hollow Pursuits. Barclay is able to make his own hologram figures of people on the crew. That just doesn't seem like a good thing.
Data security is a nightmare in their universe.
Right.
We've talked about that on the show before. Yeah. Hey, climate change. We're doing all the fun ones. Speaking of public awareness, what's it going to take to get people, or at least the people that count, on board finally with climate change? And what are we looking at if we can't?
I would say, to be blunt about it, they need a way to make money off of it.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
And this is actually one thing that's been interesting, is that solar powered has just gotten so much cheaper over the past 10 years. Wind power has gotten cheaper. There are concepts for nuclear energy that could be scalable and cheaper, I think, if people didn't attach the stigma to it. Mm-hmm. Really, I think that there is a market demand for cleaner power. I think people want it. I think what it will take is probably to be cheaper than fossil fuels. That's my cynical take.
Okay. It's kind of like the space exploration thing. There's got to be some money in it there.
That's right.
Okay, well, I can deal with that. Well, okay, good job. I put you through your paces, but you came out okay.
Okay.
Let's get back into Star Trek. You wrote an article recently, or actually a little while ago, that I really enjoyed, called 5 Leadership Lessons from Captain Kirk. And you make a point early in the article that Kirk always seems to be remembered as a devil-may-care rule breaker, but he's actually described by Gary Mitchell, a former schoolmate, as being a walking stack of books when he was at the academy. And then on my show, I'm always trying to counter what I call the myth of the sexy Kirk, that he is some reckless Lothario. And I try to emphasize that, Kirk Kirk was always about his duty and following the rules, at least in the original series. So I guess my question is, first, how does it feel to be so right about something?
It feels amazing.
Doesn't it?
I feel like time has caught up to me on that one. That article I wrote almost 7 years ago, actually. Yeah. And since then, I know that, on tour, there have been essays about the myth of Kirk, and Strange Horizons had a great essay on Kirk drift and how, it doesn't line up. There is I think, Tumblr about feminist Kirk, which one thing I didn't mention in that article, but is like if you're looking for the sexist, misogynist jerk in the original series, it's Spock.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Wow.
So, I mean, seriously, there are episodes, particularly a Mock Time, but a number of others where he is much more dismissive of women and doesn't take them seriously in a way that Kirk, really does. And it's a really interesting dichotomy, the way that the pop culture perception has evolved.
Yeah, I mean, I lay it on the films, the fact that, he steals the Enterprise and blows it up and whatnot.
Right.
But that idea of drift is really interesting, that when it comes time to reboot the films, he's suddenly an apple-munching, irresponsible asshole.
Right. So, although to be fair to the films, that might be how Kirk was if he grew up in an abusive home in a small town in Iowa where he didn't have anything better to do.
But listen to Beastie Boys, right?
Right, as opposed to the TOS Kirk, who is a survivor of a genocide and probably spent much of his adolescence dealing with PTSD. So,
right, yeah, right. And then his brother dies, and that's not a big deal, I guess. Yeah, right. Why did you choose this specific episode, The Most Toys, to discuss today?
I chose it for a couple of reasons. One being that a couple of the episodes I would have picked before, someone had already grabbed.
Oh.
But also, this is my favorite Data episode. And I love Data as a character, and I think this is a really singular performance, both for the writing of the character and also the acting.
Well, I would absolutely agree, and I can't wait to talk about it. We are talking about the Next Gen episode, The Most Toys. It is the 22nd episode of the third season, Star Trek The Next Generation. It first aired on May 7th of 1990, and it was written by Sherry Goodharts. In addition to The Most Toys, Goodharts also wrote the TNG episode Night Terrors and co-wrote the story for Violations. She was also a writing staff intern for part of TNG's third season. She also wrote for other TV shows like Gargoyles, Phantom 2040, and Young Hercules. And she wrote Dragonheart, A New Beginning, which was a sequel to the film Dragonheart. This episode was directed by Timothy Bond. He also directed the episode The Vengeance Factor for TNG, and he directed episodes of Friday the 13th, the series for Paramount. He's also directed many other TV series. He directed the 1994 TV movie Tech War, Tech Lab, starring William Shatner and based on characters from Shatner's Tech War series of novels. The stardate for this episode is 43872.2. Your assignment, Alex, if you can, is to give us a 25-word synopsis of The Most Toys.
Sure. In The Most Toys, Data finds himself once again defending his personhood, only instead of against Starfleet, where he can be rescued by Picard's pretty speeches, he's instead captured by Saul Rubinek's most evil and campy character and has to defend his personhood at the point of a Veranti disruptor.
That is perfect. Yes. I'll have to wonder if Picard had been present, if any speech could have moved the tiny cold heart of Kivas Fajo.
I'm thinking no.
I'm thinking no as well. Maybe he could trade him for something,
right.
that fish in his office or something. Yeah, we'll see. Here's some interesting facts from the memory banks about this episode. The title of this episode comes from the phrase, "He who dies with the most toys wins," an epigram that is often attributed, perhaps apocryphally, to Malcolm Forbes, businessman and publisher of Forbes Magazine, who's known for his lavish lifestyle and his many possessions, like his art collection, yachts, and Fabergé eggs. Have you heard that fact?
I have heard that fact. So,
okay.
And
just checking.
Yeah.
Makes sense. The ill-fated Type 15 shuttle pod seen in this episode is named Pike after Captain Christopher Pike, of course, former captain of the USS Enterprise. There's no word on whether a ruptured baffle plate contributed to its destruction. There are a lot of interesting props in Fajo's collection in this episode. The lapling creature is a hand puppet that was created by series makeup supervisor Michael Westmore. The 1962 Roger Maris Topps card is, of course, very valuable, as Maris hit 61 home runs in the previous year to break Babe Ruth's 1927 record. A mint version of the card, if one exists, is worth $20,000 today. The recreation of Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory, seen in the episode, was painted by Elaine Sokoloff, a scenic and graphic artist for the show. Data's Shakespeare book and his hologram of Tasha Yar appear again here, first seen in The Measure of a Man. Most of the props and costumes from this episode, like many items from TNG and other Trek productions, were sold through the online memorabilia auction site It's a Wrap. Presumably, Brent Spiner was spared from the auction block. The studio model of Fajo's craft, the Jovis, was sold at the 40 Years of Star Trek, the collection auction at Christie's in New York in 2006, and it went for $4,800. Let's talk about the guest stars for this episode, and thereby hangs a tale, to borrow from Data's Book of Shakespeare. And I have to admit that before researching this episode for this episode of my show, I didn't know any of this. Very interesting and somewhat tragic facts. Saul Rubinek, of course, plays the traitor Kivas Fajo in the episode, but he wasn't the first choice for the role. In fact, he joined the production several days into the shoot. Fajo was originally played by British actor David Rappaport, and several days of filming on the episode had been completed before Rappaport attempted suicide over a weekend break from filming. The role was quickly recast with Rubinek, who turned out to be a former schoolmate of director Timothy Bond. Rubinek was apparently in L.A. to shoot The Bonfire of the Vanities, and he was a Trek fan, and he had reportedly called Bond to see if he could come see some of the TNG sets. And I guess Bond asked him if he really wanted to see the sets up close. So that all worked out. Rappaport survived that suicide attempt, but he was later successful in taking his own life just days before The Most Toys debuted on TV in May of 1990. He's probably best known as Randall, the leader of the Bandits and Time Bandits. His untimely death was cited actually by Terry Gilliam in his decision to not pursue a sequel to Time Bandits, as he had planned for the sequel to feature Rappaport's character heavily. He also starred in the 1986 series The Wizard. I don't know if you remember this one. It was about an inventor who uses gadgets and toys to fight evil. And I remember The Wizard being on in 1986, and I remember it being a pretty good show. He would fight like evil spies, sort of comically bad, Russian foreign villains. And he'd do it like remote control cars, that would explode or little drones and stuff like that. And Gates McFadden was in the pilot episode too.
So it was like a proto MacGyver kind of.
Sort of, yeah. Do you remember the movie FX?
Yes.
I think it was sort of a spin on that too. Yeah.
Okay.
Rappaport had a chondroplastic dwarfism, and as a little person, his and the production's take on the character of Fajo was very different from what actually aired. They tried to make him seem very sinister and dangerous despite his small stature. And you can actually see his portrayal of Fajo in the unused footage from the episode, which was put on the TNG Season 3 Blu-ray as a special feature. So it's unfortunate what happened and that Rappaport wasn't able to continue in the role. But as his replacement, Saul Rubinek delivers what I feel to be, and it seems like you agree, one of the most chilling and indelible villains on Next Gen. Rubinek has been a ubiquitous face in film and television since his debut in the late 70s, and he's appeared in such films as Against All Odds, Wall Street, the aforementioned Bonfire of the Vanities, True Romance, Unforgiven, Nixon. You can see him right now on TV in The Ballad of Buster Scruggs on Netflix. And he's also been on Curb Your Enthusiasm and Stargate. And he plays, of course, Special Agent in Charge R.D. Nielsen on Warehouse 13. The name of the character, Fajo, comes from Lolita Fajo, a script coordinator for TNG, and she was also a pre-production coordinator for TNG, DS9, and Voyager. And as for the other guest stars in the episode, Jane Daly appears in the episode as Varia. Daly got her start as a model, and she worked in theater before moving to Hollywood. She made a number of film and television appearances in the 80s and 90s and aughts on shows like Nip Tuck, Felicity, and The X-Files. And she played the mother of Michelle Monaghan's character in Mission Impossible 3. Another Paramount production. And Nehemiah Persoff plays Paler Toff in the episode. This is the three-nostriled man, of course. Persoff got his start in Broadway in the 1940s, and he appeared in small roles in films like On the Waterfront and The Naked City. He's made over 200 TV guest appearances in his career and has appeared in such films as Some Like It Hot, The Last Temptation of Christ, Twins, and he also provided the voice of Papa Mouskowitz in An American Tail. He's 99 now, so he's retired from acting, but he paints in watercolors and he sells his work online.
Oh,
And maybe on special occasions he puts the gold ribbon on his head. Who knows? It's such an interesting. You can tell that the makeup department was like, what the hell? Let's. What if he had a nose in the middle of his head, or or 3 nostrils, and then I don't know. Let's give it a little flair. Let's thread a ribbon through there. I don't know how that works, but
and the giant monocle.
Yeah, and a giant monocle. Yeah, of course, he's an appraiser. Yes,
right.
That all follows.
Which it is well known to anyone who played the Star Trek customizable card game back in the day, because I think the Paylor Toff card was in like everybody's deck, because it lets you get a card you'd already used out of your discard pile.
Okay, all right.
So it was a really popular common card, and the photo, if I'm remembering correctly, is Paylor Toff peering through that giant monocle.
He's looking through it.
Yes.
So it wasn't a rare; it was like a common.
Oh yeah. So and like it literally, I think it was one of those cards that you just slotted out a spot in your deck for. Like you knew you would have at least one. Yeah.
What did they call the discard pile? There's always a fancy name for it, like it's the graveyard in Magic or whatever. Did they have a fancy name for it?
Oh boy, it has been like 15 years since I played that game.
I understand.
As I recall, I think it was literally just the discard pile. I don't think it had a fancy.
Well, that's not very creative.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember if I played the Star Wars collectible card game. Don't judge me. And they probably called it the Trash
same
Compactor.
Company.
Yeah, Decipher. Right.
Yep. So.
Is it too late for me to start a Decipher podcast?
I think probably, but I would listen. So.
At very limited listenership, but I think they'd be strong. Yeah. Well, let's talk specifically about the episode, but also about villains. They're an important part of any story, and Trek has a great share of villains, or at least I guess maybe you'd call them adversaries in Trek. There are some definitely completely evil and possibly irredeemable characters, but many characters or races in Trek become allies after a while. That's one of the good things about Trek, is that over a long enough period of time and a long enough period of negotiation and hopefully mutual understanding, the villains become your allies. And I think making the Klingons just another race in the galaxy instead of the perennial villains was one of the best moves that TNG ever made. And who knows, maybe in some future series we'll see that the Borg have found a way to live in equilibrium with the other races in the Milky Way.
That assumes we'll get a sequel show.
Yeah, so. Well, yeah, there you go. I mean, and it looks like, on the Picard series that the Romulans will be involved. With the destruction of Romulus, I think the Romulans have kind of been pushed to the negotiating table, Star Trek VI style. So maybe on the Giorgio show, we'll find out that Section 31 has been blowing up home planets in order to get races to the negotiating table. But yeah, that'd be anti-Trek. I think.
Or just because Giorgio's hungry, So.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. But you really got to watch season 2 of Discovery. You're stepping all over it, but yeah, you're gonna love it. What do you think makes a really good Trek villain?
There are different kinds of great Trek villains, and I think in the same way that there's great villains just in literature generally. I think the best Trek villains are the ones that are almost alien. Not alien in the sense of different, but just almost incomprehensible for the reasons why they do things. And I think Kivas Fajo honestly falls into that category for Data anyway. He doesn't behave in a way that anything like the way Data wants to be.
Right, yeah.
As a person. And one thing I, love about Rubinek's performance, and, I was thinking about this as I watched the episode again today to prepare for this podcast, is he is like what the Ferengi were supposed to be.
Okay, I can see
think
that, yeah.
When the Ferengi were written, Gene Roddenberry's conception is that they were, basically 19th century robber barons. And and instead we got like weird hissing energy whips and furs, and it didn't work.
Right.
But Kivas Fajo, the way he's portrayed, with basically just kind of greed and dominion as his driving force, I think is closer to the conception of the Ferengi, and shares a lot of qualities of some of the Ferengi, and particularly the bad Ferengi you see in DS9. So.
Yeah. And good villains really stand as a foil usually, for the hero. Like even somebody like Lore is like Data on a quest for self-understanding and self-realization. He's just going about it in a totally different way with no ethical subroutines to stop him. And we can understand and identify 21st century humans with the economic security that the Ferengi are after, whereas the Federation has all the benefits of having unlimited energy and free technology. And so to them, it's like, well, why are you like this? Like, I don't understand why it's so important to get currency. And it's Fajo is just he's such an exception, or he's just so strange because he's just so nihilistic and selfish. Even like the aforementioned Ferengi still need a bureaucracy. They still need an economy to work in, but it's almost like he just wants all the stuff, and he doesn't care who dies or who gets hurt to get it. And then he's going to just hide out somewhere, or he's just going to fly around and just keep all his stuff. He's got his baseball card. He's got his dolly.
From a writing perspective, what I really love about the character is that when people try to write nihilist characters like that, they tend to do a bad job of it by basically painting them as nihilists, which I think the Coen brothers did an awesome job parodying in The Big Lebowski. We're nihilists, we believe in nothing.
Right.
Whereas Fajo, like, he's a nihilist. He really just cares about himself, and there's just a lot of points where, rather than try to philosophically argue with Data, he's just more like, don't care.
Yeah, right. Another nihilist villain, or at least one who becomes it eventually and possibly insane, that comes to mind is Ducat, at the end of DS9. Before, he's almost an anti-hero, or at least he can kind of pull off the "we're not so different" speech if he decided to give it. But by the end, he's just literally trying to destroy Bajor because he can't have it.
Right.
And so it's hard to identify with somebody like that. They become just a serial villain at that point. But even somebody like Khan, you can understand. Well, the guy got stranded on a planet that blew up, and he just wants to make the guy pay. And maybe Kirk himself thinks that, maybe I've got it coming. Maybe I've lived a little too long. So I just think it's funny that with him being so diabolical, he is at the same time just so fascinating. And so much of that is, of course, as you mentioned, it's down to Rubinek's performance, which becomes even more exceptional and fascinating when you realize that he had to get that together probably over a weekend. Like they probably FedExed him the script, and it's like, okay, see you Monday. I don't know what you're going to do. We're going to put a thing under your nose, and boom, you're an alien, and just get out there. And he wasn't really like a TV guy at this time. He was a movie guy. He had been in a bunch of movies in the 80s. The Bonfire of the Vanities might have helped put a stop to that. but yeah, I mean, so his friend Ford, the director, was afraid that he wouldn't even do it. And to have him come in and go, okay, I guess I can see what's going on here. I'm going to add my own sort of je ne sais quoi to it, and his kind of giggling and hopping around and the clicks, when he's testing Data. It's just like, it's the type of thing that you don't normally see on TNG with everybody's received pronunciation and their metered sort of demeanor.
Yeah, it's great. And if I recall correctly too, I think he'd done theater with Brent Spiner before.
Oh, really? Okay.
So
sure.
So I think they knew each other, and it's just the way their performances play off each other is just really astonishing. And with Spiner doing his Data thing, and just contrasting that with just how flamboyantly evil Rubinek played the character, it's just a great dichotomy, and yet they still have like a great chemistry when they're together. It's just really, I think they elevated each other, and they're both great actors in the first place. So
I have to wonder if Fajo has ever tried to kidnap anybody before. Do you know what I mean? Like he's really good at it and almost gets away with it.
I can't imagine this was the first time.
Yeah.
The episode pretty strongly implies that Fajo's crew are like his slaves.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think you're right that it's not the first time. And, part of Varya's arc, I think, is realizing, she thought she'd gotten in good with him and, maybe she started out lowly, but now she was, she had respect and all that. And that realization that, to Fajo, she not only was she another item in his collection, she was an expendable one. There's always another Varya, he says. Right.
Yeah.
So
maybe it's like a serial killer in that apparently they sort of evolve or they progress. So you're torturing cats and then you work your way up to somebody vulnerable. And so because I just feel like when he is trading arguments with Data, it just seems practiced. Like I'm sure that he's argued with people over, acquiring things or over deals before, but he's already got all this stuff about, oh, well, you're part of the military, and you're part of Starfleet. What are your accomplishments? Aren't you a soldier? Have you killed anybody? And he's just got all these things ready to go. And of course, it's interesting. It's like he doesn't respect Data, but also he takes the time to make all these arguments. Like if he really doesn't care, if it was like Maddox and this episode is like you mentioned, it's like Measure of a Man 2, basically. Maddox doesn't think Data is alive, and so therefore he doesn't really respect him. But Fajo goes to all this trouble of putting a living being in his menagerie, a sentient living being, not a Lulu puppet, and yet he's able to have these solipsistic conversations with him, and it's just like, wow, that's evil. You're evil, guy, in your little tights.
Right. Yeah, it's almost, in some respects, like he kind of wanted Data, not just because he was, the only sentient android, that they knew about then, but because he kind of wanted an audience.
There you go. It's like his own, like he's putting on a show and he wants a part of the collection that can admire the collection. That's some serial killer shit.
He knew Data so well, like you mentioned, having all this information about him. Yeah. You have to imagine he knows about, his hearing before Starfleet. I'm sure that made the Wire reports.
Sure.
So
yeah, right.
So I think he took a perverse pleasure in treating him in dehumanizing Data, in part because of that court ruling.
Yeah,
so, at least in my head he does. So.
And that's good headcanon, I think. It's I like mine is the serial killer thing. I'm going to stick onto that. But and that's a sore spot for Data insofar as he can have sore spots, his personhood. And that's another thing is that like good villains always challenge the hero's convictions. And I don't think that we as an audience really believe that any of Fajo's facile arguments about the military or Starfleet are going to sway Data. But his disregard of Data's existence, and not only that, but his accomplishments, make us wonder if maybe Data's got the right idea. Maybe Data should just kill him before something worse happens.
So I think what's interesting about this to me is that, I realize there are several camps on this, but I've always been in the camp that Data has always been developing emotions.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And that he didn't quite know it himself because he was so fixated on having human-like emotions, he didn't recognize his own android-like emotions. Mm-hmm. And I think this episode in particular is a centerpiece for that. And I've had conversations with people before, and some people really hate the end of this episode because they're like, Data had like X, Y, and Z ways out without killing Fajo. And my take on all of this, and I think the episode supports this, is that Data was not just, he had certainly, I'm sure, rationalized in his brain that Kivas Fajo was deadly and he couldn't, let him walk around. But I think he was also pissed. And
Okay.
I don't know that he knew he was pissed. He was kind of pissed in the way that Vulcans get pissed, where they rationalize their pettiness, and
Right.
come up with some sort of logical trap for it.
Right.
I think Data kind of did that in some of the same ways, but I think, he had befriended Varia and seeing kind of the almost, for lack of a better word, orgasmic delight that Fajo had in killing her.
Yeah.
I think fundamentally made him angry. And the end scene, where Data comes down and just says, I don't feel pleasure, I'm just an android. He clearly does feel pleasure in that moment, or else why would he be down there to confront him in the first place?
Yeah.
So.
That's I love that theory, and that would be a real long con for the writers to start this in season 3. But I'm sure that was on their mind, the idea of his developing personality and possibly emotions. But I can't think of except to just see and confirm that he is finally locked up. But
right.
Yeah, it does seem like a taunt, I gotta say.
Yeah.
An inflectionless taunt.
Right.
He's not doing a pee-pee dance, but it's pretty close. It's what's so funny to me is, you mentioned like, oh, well, there's like 1, 2, 3 ways that he could get out of that.
Right.
Kind of. I mean,
right.
I guess I could, Fajo's plan is pretty good as plans go. He's ready. He's ready for the FAA investigation, after the shuttle blows up. He's created this plan where the Enterprise can't commit to the investigation because they have to run off to solve a problem way far away that he created. And he even made a profit by selling the solution to the problem that he created. So the Ferengis are thumbs up there. But the follow-up isn't great. He immediately goes back to I guess maybe he's just acting casual, but he goes right back to the space lanes and just living his life. He probably should have gone to just some remote planet and just, went to ground until the storm blew over. But maybe he underestimated the capabilities of the crew of the Enterprise. And Geordi sleeping in his clothes, thinking about the problem.
Well, they already look like pajamas. You might as well sleep.
Yeah, right. Just take your pips off and you're good to go.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, but I think the episode pretty strongly implies that, but for Geordi obsessing about it, they would have just gone on and not figured it out.
Yeah, right. And not so much as a thank you at the end from Data.
Right.
That's off screen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Data with unlimited. Theoretically unlimited patience and an unlimited lifespan. He could have just acquiesced to Fajo's demands until some later moment where Fajo's guard is down or he slips up and makes, some kind of mistake and allows him to escape.
Right.
But of course, Data being unexperienced emotionally, normally if Picard was in the situation, if Kirk was in this situation,
right.
He would have seduced Varia, got one of those disruptors, and he would have been fine. But with Data's lack of, emotional intelligence, he's just, I love the fact that Fajo, he wakes up, Fajo explains the whole thing to him, and Data's like, okay, well, I'm going to escape, so see ya. And of course that doesn't work because no episode, but yeah, right. he doesn't really understand. And of course he tries literally passive resistance when he just sort of freezes up. But of course that puts Varia's life in danger. So yeah, you have to wonder, like you would with any episode, how it would play out differently. But it's definitely the perfect trap for our emotionally stunted android Data.
Right. No, I definitely agree with that. And I think, you could even make the argument that maybe Data really didn't have any other choice. But I like to think there was some emotionally motivated reasoning behind that.
I think it's plausible.
So, it's a few episodes after he absorbed Lol's neural net. So even if you want a technological explanation, you could say he started to develop emotions because of Lol. And I kind of think that might have been the intent of the writers, but one thing that I will complain about the whole idea of the emotion chip, I think, wrecked Data's emotional character journey.
Yeah.
So it kept really swinging wildly after that, and it was very inconsistent after Brothers, and definitely on into the movies and things like that. So
Yeah, well, they had a brain drain at that point, with
Right.
sort of scattering of the writing crew. But yeah, it's tough because you want Pinocchio to become a boy at some
Right.
point. And so if he does, there's no more story. And of course, they're caught in this. We have to continue to tell these stories forever. So, and then we got, of course, the abrupt end that we did with Data. That's the one
Right.
thing for me. I don't know if it's possible, but some kind of follow up or like a better ending for the story of Data would be what I would want out of the Picard series if they're open to that. Load him into another body. He had a backup copy or something like that, or just give us some sort of shot at seeing a sort of a better resolution for his story.
Yeah, I just really just prefer to think that Nemesis never happened.
Yeah, or just retcon it out of existence. Yeah,
Right.
a little time travel, we're good.
Yeah.
I want to get some confirmation, from the powers that be that Data is a person, or that we finally accepted that, even in Nemesis, which the existence of Nemesis is still in debate, but you've got everybody standing around, you've got his friends and his crewmates who are sort of toasting and remembering him, but this episode is sort of a follow-up to Measure of a Man. We get later episodes, like you mentioned, Brothers, where he develops more, but it's still like the last time Starfleet really checked in on this, all they ruled is that they didn't rule that he was human. They just ruled that they didn't own him. So if, the powers that be, if the Enterprise couldn't figure this out and they had to call the big guns in, what would they be coming to do? Can Data be kidnapped? Is he being kidnapped if he's not a person?
Right.
Would Starfleet intervene to retrieve, it's one of its officers or just important material?
That's an interesting perspective. This again, but I keep coming back to Offspring, in part because I almost picked that. So
Yeah, that's the one.
but they dealt with that legal issue again, and interestingly enough, they resolve it by killing Lal, so you never do find out how that would resolve itself.
Yeah.
So no, it's a great question, and actually one of the things that I didn't remember until I had read it or watched this episode again was when Wesley and Geordi are raiding Data's stuff, and they come across his medals, and Geordi just makes this offhand comment of not bad for a walking pile of circuitry, something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, the way LeVar Burton delivered the line was really weird because I couldn't tell if he was being affectionate or dismissive or what.
It's probably.
And I think you have to imagine it was, meant out of affection because, half the episode is him trying to get his bro back. Yeah. But the way the line delivery was just really off, and I didn't like what. It stood out. I think in part because it was an episode about Data asserting his personhood. So
yeah, they blew the other takes. That they had to go with that one, so there was no choice.
Right.
I was just thinking, speaking of villains with the potential to be friends, The Defector, of course, is an episode that I really like from season 3. And on the subject of guest stars, Sarek is also another great guest star, great performance. The episode that surrounds it, I'm not super thrilled about. When Geordi and Wes are fighting over a hot tub about something stupid about how Geordi can't get any play or whatever. But having Mark Lenard on, and then of course having the amazing performance by Patrick Stewart. There's been great example, probably top 5. I've just forgot his name. Saul Rubinek, in terms of best guest stars. But there's been a lot of great guest stars, and I have nothing to say against the performances of the regulars on Star Trek. I mean, they're solid. They're all accomplished, talented actors. But when they bring somebody in with a certain gravitas, or an actor that doesn't do a lot of genre work, it just seems to add something extra. People like David Warner Who I
Right.
guess, to be fair, does do genre work, or Gene Simmons, or or Louise Fletcher, on DS9. It's like, what is Nurse Ratched doing on this show? But then she turns out to
She's
be
so great
one of the
on
best
that
villains.
show.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
or like David Ogden Stiers, or Frank Langella. Like,
Right.
Frank Langella's going to be the bad guy. Yeah, it's
well,
Skeletor is trying to take over Bajor. It's perfect.
Well, and if you're talking great guest stars in season 3, there's also Tony Todd in Sins of the Father.
Yeah,
Who is just awesome as Kern, and then when he comes back, and really we're talking about Data's character arc in this episode, but Sins of the Father also kicks off really the beginning of Worf's character arc.
Yes.
And that goes all the way to the last season of DS9 in spectacular fashion. Worf is like, I can't imagine historians of the future, the 25th century. You have the Enterprise, which has Picard, who apparently is only remembered for destroying the Toxu Tot. I imagine Riker's probably remembered for, single-handedly stopping the Borg from destroying the Federation. But then there's also Worf, who's like the pivotal figure of Klingon politics in the 24th century.
Yeah.
So it's, I wonder if Data's even like, with his inglorious end is just kind of a footnote in the history. Like, oh, they also had an android. He was kind of neat.
Yeah, possibly. This is my headcanon. I'm just projecting forward to what I think might be in future iterations of the series. But if there is a Federation Romulan alliance or pact, it should be called like the Data Pact or something like that, because he's really the guy who, I guess he wasn't really threatening Romulus. They were coming for Earth or whatever, but still he helped win the war that hopefully started an alliance between them, until of course the planet blew up. I just remembered that Romulus blew up. They got a lot of work cut out for them, let's just say that.
Yes, they do. And
they don't have Spock to help them.
Yeah.
Is there anything left unsaid? Anything that you have to say still about this episode, The Most Toys?
The other thing, I don't know if we dove into it a whole lot, but I really did appreciate the kind of whimsical aspects of Data's character that it showed. And really the whole episode, if it was, it's a great episode, but even if it was total garbage, if it still had the scene of him trying to imitate the Mona Lisa's smile, it would be totally worth it. And
it's such a part of, it's just his character, but it's also a part of like not being able to feel fear or overly feel concern. Like when Captain Picard is captured, he's like talking to the prisoners. Can we eat these urinal cakes? All these things he's trying to figure out. And Data's just like, well, I've probably got a few hours before this guy comes back. Maybe I could just look at the Mona Lisa for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. But which again, I think speaks to, his emotional character. He's curious. He's interested in the world around him. If you sometimes talk to people, this episode is like, Data should have like destroyed the baseball card until Fajo let him go or something like that. I'm like, but I'm like, Data wouldn't do that because he would understand, that these things are precious artifacts that should be, returned where they belong, and they're a part of history. And like, it's just, that would not be in keeping, that would be less in keeping with Data's character than him, trying to murder Kivas Fajo. So,
Yeah. And it's part of that great dichotomy between the characters, because Fajo, all he cares about is this stuff. Data doesn't really care about material stuff. He's totally selfless, but he understands that other people care about that stuff. And so he, even without that attachment, he wouldn't really do that. And that's really what I think, if you want to believe, and I do, I know you do, and Data, Brent Spiner, and the writer of Goodhart's, the writer of the episode, both really wanted to have that scene where he does pull the trigger at the end. And I think the producers actually put that line in where he's like, oh, maybe something happened to it. Even in that decision, he's trying to weigh the needs of the many over the needs of the one.
Sure.
So, yeah.
It's a great line delivery, and the way he looks at Riker. I think it's the first time he bluffed Riker. There
you go.
So, which does lead us to, my favorite part of Time Zero, which is not a great set of episodes, but it is a fun set of episodes.
Yes.
And I love that the whole Enterprise crew is completely useless in the past, whereas Data turned his comm badge into a fortune by suckering people at poker.
Right, yeah. Yeah. I like when they go back in time and Captain Picard's first instinct is like, let's put on a play. Come on, everybody. We're players. You feel like we all like Captain Picard, but maybe he's that guy who you give him like 1 extra hour at the company picnic and he's got everybody doing something really stupid and playing games. And you're just like, oh, boy. Yeah, hey, I got to go.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Should have had kids.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Well, let's speaking of fathers and kids, let's talk about My Space Dad Can Beat Up Your Space Dad. Who's your favorite captain and why?
So this has evolved for me over the years. There was a point in my life I would have said Cisco. There was a point in my life I would have said Picard, especially when I was a kid. As I've gotten older, Kirk has like circled around to being my favorite. I think he is the most all-around interesting character, and we talked about the Kirk drift and all that. I think in some ways maybe defending his character against some of the caricature has given me more fondness for him. But a few years back, I decided to rewatch all of Star Trek start to finish, and really just came out of a TOS loving Kirk, and really just thinking that the parodies of William Shatner's acting are overblown, because I think a lot of times he's really subtle with Kirk.
Yeah.
But really just appreciate his character and his curiosity and his ethics and his passion for exploration and relationship with Spock and McCoy and the whole 9 yards. So I'm going to kick it old school and say Kirk. Sounds good to me.
Now that we've reached the end of the show, you will receive a commission in the rank of ensign. What department on the ship do you work in?
I'm going to have to go with stellar cartography. Is the coolest room, and you seem to be at the least risk for being, killed by the villain of the week. So,
yeah, I'd imagine that it's ironic that it would be deep in the ship. I imagine it's within the superstructure of the ship, and yet you're supposed to be studying the stars. But I guess
I didn't even understand why the room exists in the first place. But yeah. I feel like a lot of jobs on the Enterprise are make-work jobs.
It does seem like a job where there's a lot of like online browsing and solitaire possibly involved, and then you hear the swish of the doors and you flip over to the stars and you're like, yeah, I'm working.
Like, what does O'Brien do all day? That's I was. No wonder he picked a new job, because like he had to be so bored half the time.
Right. So. Yeah. Every dirty replicator he's cleaning out on Terek Noir, he's like, I should have never left that transporter room. I had it so good. Well, Ensign Knapp, thanks for joining me to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can, at EISTpod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
You can find me on Twitter. I am the Alex Knapp. And I'm also, you can read my articles at Forbes.com/sites/Alex Knapp.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining me.
All right. Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Yes, and we are signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.